There are seasons that do not simply pass through time, but pass through the soul, like a quiet judgment and a gentle mercy at once. This month is not arriving as a continuation of what was, but as a deliberate interruption of the familiar. Something within you may already sense it, the strange feeling that yesterday's patterns no longer fit today's spirit. It is as though heaven has leaned closer, not to entertain your desires, but to reshape your direction. And what feels different is not the world, but what God is doing within you. This month will not reward your old ways of thinking. It will expose them with mercy rather than punishment. It will expose them with mercy rather than punishment. And that distinction matters more than the mind first understands. For exposure without mercy would crush a man into bitterness. But exposure wrapped in mercy becomes something closer to revelation, like a gentle unmasking that does not mock your former ignorance but quietly outgrows it. You will find that many of the thoughts you once carried, like in hairy, ached furniture in the mind, heavy, unquestioned, assumed to be part of your inner architecture, begin to feel strangely unsuitable. Though the room of your inner life has been subtly expanded, and those old arrangements no longer fit without awkwardness. It is not that truth has changed its nature, but that you are being brought nearer to it, and proximity always alters perception. Will be moments when you attempt to think as you once did, only to discover that the thought collapses under its own familiarity, like a bridge built for a smaller traveler. What you once called practicality may begin to reveal itself as fear in respectable clothing, and what you once dismissed as hope may appear, to your surprise, as the only thing that was ever truly rational. The mind resists this at first, because it prefers a world in which it is already settled, already sufficient, already in possession of the final map. Yet this month seems to suggest that the map was never the territory, and perhaps not even the best attempt at one. You may notice, too, that God does not argue with your old ways of thinking in the manner of a rival thinker. He does not crush them with loud contradiction. Instead, he allows life itself to quietly demonstrate their limits. A repeated pattern will fail to produce its expected outcome, not dramatically, but consistently. Until you are forced into the strange humility of reconsideration. It is a kindness that feels like disruption. It is a correction that arrives dressed as ordinary disappointment, though it is not truly disappointment at all, but redirection. In this unsettling clarity, you may feel at times as though you are losing something essential, as though the scaffolding of certainty is being removed before you are ready to stand without it. Yet even this feeling carries within it a hidden invitation, as though you are being asked whether you truly believed those old certainties were the foundation or merely the familiar. There is a difference between what is familiar and what is true, though in calmer months the two are often mistaken for one another without protest. And so the exposure continues, not violently but persistently, like dawn refusing to negotiate with the night. Thoughts that once ruled unchallenged now hesitate before the smallest scrutiny. New possibilities quiet, almost shy, begin to suggest themselves at the edges of awareness. You do not yet trust them, but you can no longer entirely dismiss them either. This is how the mind begins to loosen its grip on inherited limitation, not through force, but through a gradual reordering of what can no longer be unseen. Though the very structure of reasoning begins to shift beneath the weight of something both unsettling and strangely familiar. As though the mind begins to, what once felt delayed, will begin to reveal itself as divinely restrained, not denied. And this realization arrives not as comfort at first, but as a quiet dismantling of impatience. The human mind is rarely gentle with waiting. It interprets silence as absence, and absence as rejection. Yet in this month, that interpretation begins to fracture under the weight of unfolding meaning. You will look back at certain moments that once felt like closed doors and begin to notice, with a strange clarity, that they were never truly sealed against you, only held in restraint by a wisdom that does not operate on the urgency of desire. There is a difference between denial and divine delay, though in lived experience they often feel identical until time reveals their separation. What you called no may have been a not yet, spoken in a language your impatience could not translate. And so the heart, which once mourned what it did not receive, Begins to encounter a more difficult truth that receiving too early might have broken what was meant to endure. This is not a comforting thought at first, because it requires the surrender of the belief that timing is always an ally of readiness. You may begin to observe how certain patterns of your life refuse to align, no matter how carefully you adjusted them. Effort was present. Sincerity was present. Even sacrifice was present, yet alignment remained absent. And now, in retrospect, it becomes less of a mystery and more of a design. What was restrained was not your worth, but your exposure to outcomes you were not yet shaped to carry. The restraint itself becomes a form of protection that you did not recognize at the time, because protection rarely announces itself in the language of relief. There is also a deeper, unsettling truth emerging beneath this understanding that delay is not passive but active. It is not emptiness holding you back, but formation holding you in place. Something in you was being adjusted while you were waiting. You were not aware of the adjustment taking place. Character was being slowed into maturity. Desire was being refined away from dependence on immediate gratification. Your understanding of success was being quietly corrected from possession to alignment, from arrival to readiness. And so what once felt like suspended progress begins to resemble structured preparation. The waiting itself was not empty. It was densely occupied with unseen shaping. In this light, the past does not change, but its meaning does. Our meaning is often more powerful than event. You begin to understand that the architecture of your life was never responding to urgency, but to readiness, and readiness is measured in depth rather than desperation. Even now, there is a subtle shift occurring in how you relate to what has not yet arrived. The urgency begins to soften, not because desire has died, but because interpretation has matured. You are no longer simply asking why it has not come, but beginning to wonder what had to become different within you for its arrival to be sustainable. And that question alone signals that something within your perception is already being uttered into a quieter kind of understanding, where waiting is no longer a void, of a hidden corridor of preparation stretching forward without visible end, yet carrying within it the quiet certainty that nothing essential has been withheld without purpose. The silence you feared will become the space, where new understanding is formed, and at first this silence does not feel like a gift at all. It resembles absence in its most unsettling form, the kind that removes familiar noise without immediately replacing it with meaning. The human heart is rarely comfortable with such emptiness, because it instinctively assumes that sound equals presence and silence equals abandonment. Yet in this month, that assumption begins to erode, not through explanation, but through experience that slowly refuses to confirm your old interpretations. You will notice that what once felt like God's distance was, in fact, a kind of hidden nearness that did not speak in the language you were accustomed to hearing. Silence is not empty, it is concentrated. It is the stillness in which lesser interpretations are allowed to fade so that a deeper awareness can take shape without competition. At first, you will attempt to fill it, as though silence were a mistake that must be corrected by activity, distraction, or mental noise. But each attempt will reveal its own limitation, leaving you not with answers but with a more honest confrontation with yourself. There is a strange severity in silence when it begins to work upon the soul. It removes the comfort of immediate explanation. It does not allow you to rush toward conclusions that feel good but are not yet true. In this restraint, something within you is being trained to endure not knowing without despairing. This is not the absence of guidance, but the removal of dependency on constant reassurance. And in that removal, a different kind of perception begins to awaken. One that is less reactive and more receptive. You may find that memories say differently in silence. Events you once interpreted quickly now return with layers you did not notice before, as though silence has slowed your inner vision enough for detail to become visible. Even your prayers, once shaped by urgency, begin to lose their frantic edges, not because desire has weakened, but because desperation is being refined into something steadier. There is a growing recognition that not every answer must arrive instantly to be meaningful, and not every pause is a problem to be solved. What once felt like distance begins to resemble depth. and depth cannot be rushed without distortion. You start to sense that silence is not the opposite of communication, but a different form of it. One that does not cater to impatience, but instead invites reflection that cannot be achieved through noise. In this space, understanding is not delivered, it is formed slowly, almost imperceptibly. Like light gathering in a room before the eye realizes the dawn has already begun. And, so the silence that once unsettled you begins to lose its threatening shape. It no longer feels like something happening against you, but something happening within you. As though the absence of external sound has become the condition under which internal clarity can finally speak without interruption. And that clarity does not arrive as a conclusion, but as a deepening awareness that was never accessible while everything was still too loud to hear what was already forming beneath it. You will. Honest strength rising in places where resignation once quietly lived, and this emergence will not feel like sudden victory, but like something long buried remembering its original authority. Resignation is rarely loud when it enters a life. It arrives softly, disguised as maturity, patience, or realism, until it settles into the inner architecture of thought and begins to define the limits of expectation. It teaches the soul to expect less, not out of wisdom, but out of weariness, until even hope begins to speak in reduced tones. Yet in this month, something within that quiet surrender begins to shift, not violently, but with a steady reversal that feels almost like remembering. At first, you may not recognize this return of strength, because it will not resemble the confidence you once associated with ambition or certainty. It will be quieter than that. Less dependent on visible outcomes, less concerned with immediate validation. It will begin as a refusal, not dramatic or emotional, but simple and firm, a refusal to continue agreeing with conclusions that were formed in exhaustion rather than truth. Where resignation once said, "This is how it will always be," something deeper within you begins to answer, not with argument, but with endurance. There is a peculiar moment when the soul realizes it has been living beneath its own capacity, not because it lacked ability, but because it accepted limitations that were never truly final. In that realization, strength does not as addition, but as restoration. It feels less like becoming someone new and more like being returned to yourself after a long absence from clarity. What was once surrendered in fatigue begins to feel recoverable. Not all at once, but piece by piece, as if life is gently handing back what resignation had quietly placed in storage. You may find that situations which once discouraged you no longer produce the same internal conclusion. A meaning you used to assign to difficulty begins to change. Where you once interpreted resistance as a signal to withdraw, you begin to see it as a space where endurance can be formed without announcement. This does not make the difficulty less real, but it changes the authority it holds over your interpretation of yourself. The external remains challenging, but the internal narrative begins to lose its agreement with defeat. There is also a subtle awakening in how you respond to your own thoughts. The inner voice that once accepted limitation with question begins to hesitate before doing so again. It no longer speaks with the same unquestioned finality. Instead, it is met by a quieter but firmer awareness that not all conclusions deserve permanence. And in that awareness, strength is not loud or theatrical. It is precise, measured, and surprisingly patient with its own return. And so what was once resignation begins to lose its shape, not through force, but through disuse. It no longer feels like truth, only like a habit of interpretation that is slowly being outgrown. In its place, something steadier begins to form, not built on denial of difficulty, but on a refusal to let difficulty define the final definition of who you are becoming, as though strength itself is quietly reclaiming ground it never truly abandoned. Only ceased to occupy for a season of misunderstanding, doors will not merely open, they will open with meaning that unsettles comfort. And this is where the month begins to feel less like permission and more invitation. A door, in the ordinary imagination, is simply an entry or exit, a practical transition between one state and another. But in this unfolding, a door is never only structural, it is interpretive. It does not just change where you stand. It challenges what you believed about where you belonged. And so when these openings begin to appear, they will not arrive dressed in neutrality. They will carry implication, and implication is often more disruptive than difficulty. At first, you may assume that an open door is the end of tension, the resolution of waiting, the settling of uncertainty into relief. Yet what you will encounter is more complex. The opening itself will not resolve everything, it will reveal what you have become while waiting. And this revelation is where comfort begins to lose its authority. For you may discover that you are not the same person who once prayed for what is now within reach. The desire remains, but the identity that carried it has been quietly reshaped in the process of delay, silence, and inner refinement. There is a strange trembling that accompanies meaningful opportunity. Not because it is harmful, but because it is honest. It does not flatter the old self. It asks for a version of you that is no longer improvising survival, but capable of stewardship. And this is where comfort becomes unsettled. For comfort prefers familiarity, repetition, and predictable identity. But these doors do not simply accommodate who you were. They require engagement with who you are now being asked to become. You will also notice that not every open door feels immediately desirable. Some will feel too large for your current expectations, others too precise for your current assumptions. And this mismatch will create a subtle internal tension, as though what is available is slightly ahead of what you are prepared to interpret. Yet this is not confusion, it is expansion. The mind often interprets expansion as discomfort because it cannot immediately categorize what exceeds its previous boundaries of meaning. In this space, discernment becomes more important than desire. And not every opening is meant to be entered in haste, and not every invitation is designed for immediate acceptance. Some doors are open not to rush you forward, but to reveal direction more clearly than urgency ever could. And in that revelation, you begin to realize that openness is not simply about access, but about alignment. And alignment often requires a deeper listening than ambition is used to practicing. And so these doors do not simply change your surroundings. They challenge your interpretation of readiness, timing, and worthiness. They ask questions that cannot be answered by excitement alone. And as they open, what unsettles comfort is not loss, but the realization that movement is no longer about escaping limitation, about stepping into responsibility shaped by something far greater than impulse, as though each opening is quietly in say. That access is only the beginning of a far more demanding and meaningful encounter. What drains you will lose its authority over your attention and affection, and this change will not arrive as sudden liberation, but as a quiet withdrawal of inner agreement. For much of life, exhaustion is not only caused by circumstances, but by the attention we continue to give them. Certain people, patterns, memories, and emotional cycles do not sustain themselves by force alone, but by the subtle consent of the mind that keeps returning to them. In this month, that consent begins to weaken, not through effortful resistance, but through a growing inability to find meaning in what once consumed you so completely. At first, you may still encounter the same influences, the same triggers, the same familiar emotional pulls that once drew your thoughts into repetition. But something will be different in your response. Where there was once immediate engagement, there will now be a kind of distance. It is not coldness, but clarity. You will observe without absorbing, recognize without entering, and remember without being pulled back into participation. This is not indifference. It is the beginning of freedom from what previously disguised itself as necessity. There is a subtle but profound shift when the soul begins to withdraw its investment from what no longer gives life. That does not always announce itself with decisive action. Often it begins as a loss of fascination. What once felt urgent begins to feel repetitive. What once felt emotionally charged begins to feel strangely empty, not because it has changed, but because you have begun to see it without illusion. And once illusion weakens, attachment begins to lose its foundation. You may notice that certain emotional loops no longer complete themselves the way they used to. A conversation in your mind that once replayed endlessly begins to lose momentum mid-cycle, as though it forgets how to sustain its own intensity. This is not suppression, it is transformation of perception. The mind is no longer feeding what the soul has quietly stopped endorsing. And without that inner endorsement, even the strongest emotional patterns begin to lose their influence. There is also a growing recognition that not everything demanding your attention deserves your presence. This recognition does not come as theory, but as lived experience. You attempt to return to old patterns and find less and less of yourself available there. Not because you are forcing separation, but because your inner world is no longer resonating with what once felt unavoidable. The drain remains, but the participation fades, and in that fading authority is removed without confrontation. And so what once pulled you into cycles of depletion begins to lose its grip, not through struggle, but through disinterest born of deeper clarity. You are not fighting it, you are outgrowing the version of yourself that needed it. And in that quiet shift attention becomes more selective, affection becomes more protected. An energy begins to gather where life is actually being formed, rather than where it was once continuously spent without return. You will not become someone else, but you will no longer remain who you were before this month began. And this distinction is where the deepest transformation quietly lives. Change is often imagined as replacement, as though the self is discarded and a new identity is placed in its stead. But what is unfolding here is more subtle, more unsettling, and more honest than that. It is not substitution, but refinement, not erasure, but reordering. The core remains, yet its structure is being reorganized in ways that alter how it responds, how it perceives, and how it endures. There is a strange moment in every real transformation when a person looks at their own thoughts and realizes they no longer fully belong to them in the way they once did, not because they are alien, but because they are no longer absolute. What once felt like unquestionable identity begins to feel like a former draft of understanding. You recognize yourself in it. Yet you also recognize that you have begun to outgrow its conclusions. This creates a quiet tension between memory and becoming. As though the past self is still visible, but no longer fully authoritative. You will still carry your history, but it will begin to lose its power to define your direction. The weight of previous interpretations begins to lighten, not because the events change, but because their meaning is no longer fixed. What once shaped your identity now becomes material for reflection rather than limitation. And in this shift, you begin to realize that continuity does not require stagnation. You are still you. Yet the boundaries of what you means are expanding beyond their former certainty. There will be moments of disorientation within this process. Brief encounters with your own unfamiliarity. You may respond to situations differently than you expected, or feel a hesitation where old reactions used to appear instantly. This is not confusion in the destructive sense, but the space between one structure dissolving and another forming. In that space, identity is not lost, it is loosened. And what is loosened can be reshaped without violence. Over time, you begin to notice that the self you once defended so carefully is no longer under threat, because it is no longer the final version of who you are becoming. There is less urgency to preserve old patterns, less need to justify familiar limitations, less fear in acknowledging that growth has altered your internal language. What once felt like fixed traits begin to reveal themselves as stages of development rather than permanent definitions. And so the month does not end with a different person standing in your place, but with the same person standing in a wider understanding of themselves. The continuity remains, but it is no longer confined by its earlier bound. Aries, you are still present within your own story, yet the story itself has begun to expand beyond the assumptions that once defined its limits. As though identity has quietly stepped beyond its earlier frame and discovered that becoming was never meant to stop at recognition, but to continue unfolding without final conclusion.